And so, good evening, everyone. My name is Savannah Lytle, and I'm currently serving with MountainTrue through AmeriCorps Project Conserve. Thank you all for tuning in tonight. If this is your first MountainTrue University, welcome. MountainTrue University is a speaker series that began back at the start of the pandemic in 2020, where we have different members of our staff or folks associated with MountainTrue give a talk on something that they're experts on or have a lot of knowledge about. And this webinar series happens more infrequently now as we have more in-person events offered, but occasionally we still hold these webinars on different topics. So if you really enjoyed this one and you want to watch more, we have all our previous ones recorded, and they're both uploaded to our YouTube and our website under events. So if you're unfamiliar with MountainTrue, I just wanted to give you a little bit real quick about MountainTrue. It's an environmental nonprofit spread across the Southern Blue Ridge, and we aim to help create resilient forests, clean waters, and healthy, equitable communities. And there's lots of ways to get involved if you're interested. Different things through educational programs to guided hikes to volunteer opportunities and so much more. So today, as you all know, we have our public lands field biologist, Josh Kelly, here to talk about the forest plan. And before I pass it over, I just want to give a few quick notes on Zoom and how it'll go tonight. So I know a lot of us have probably spent way too much time at this point on Zoom, but in case it's new to you or the webinar format that we're using tonight is, I just want to give you some quick tips. So if you scroll your mouse on your computer or you swipe your screen on your phone, at the bottom of the screen, you should see a little menu appear. And this menu has some different icons on it. One of these is the Q&A icon that you don't see in just a regular Zoom meeting. So if you have a question while Josh is presenting, if you just want to put it in that Q&A box, if it's a clarifying question, Josh is going to answer it then, but if it's one that can wait, he'll answer the bulk of questions at the end after he talks a little bit about the forest plan. And with this being a webinar, just so you all know, you don't have video or audio on, so you should be able to see us, but we can't see you guys. And if you have any other questions about how Zoom works, feel free to drop them in either chat and I'll do my best to answer them. And just so you're aware, if you're coming in late, this is being recorded, so it will be posted on our YouTube and our website. So if either you want to rewatch it or share it with anyone, then you're welcome to do that. It should be posted sometime tomorrow. So with all of that, I'll turn it over to Josh.
Thanks, Savannah, and thanks everybody for taking some time out of your Monday afternoon to learn about the revised forest plan for Nantahala-Pisgah National Forest. We have done several educational talks on the forest plan, and this has been a long process. And so this talk assumes that you know a little bit about national forests and forest plans. And so I'm not going to go too deep into the entire forest plan process, more going to get some of the what I think are the important points about what we've seen in the revised plan, and then hope that you all want to ask some questions about the things you care about. So I'll leave plenty of time for a discussion towards the end. And let's see if I can get my screen shared and show you my presentation. Let's see. All right, it looks like it's working on my end. If it's not working on your end, please chime in the chat. So yeah, here we are after almost 10 years with a nearly finalized forest plan for Nantahala and Pisgah National Forest. And of course, we've been under a forest plan for quite a while. Officially, we're still under the 1987 forest plan. And that forest plan was amended significantly in 1994. So we've really been under about the same forest plan for over 20 years. And that's kind of the lifespan of forest plans. And right now, unfortunately, my slides are not progressing very well, but finally it did. So I just want to, as part of the hitting the highlights, just clarify that there are a lot of different kinds of federal public land, of which national forests are just one. And there are several different agencies that manage public lands. The Department of the Interior manages national parks and the largest unit of public land in the nation, which is the Bureau of Land Management. That's Bureau of Land Management is entirely in the Western United States. We also have national wildlife refuges managed by the Fish and Wildlife Service, and we have national forest and grasslands owned and operated by the U.S. Forest Service. And of course, the bulk of federal public lands are in the West. But as far as federal public lands go, North Carolina pretty much leads among all Eastern states with about nearly 12% of our land mass, North Carolina being federally owned. And, that seemed pretty high to me, so I actually checked up on that number. And what really contributes a lot to that number, pushes us over the edge, is actually military bases, like Fort Bragg and Cherry Point and Camp Lejeune and places like that. So those are also federal lands. And they're public lands, but they have a fence around them, so you're not allowed to go on those. National forests, of course, don't have a fence around them, and we can visit them and recreate in them just about any time we want, so long as there's not a government shutdown. So the U.S. Forest Service, again, is under the Department of Agriculture, about 193 million acres. I've also heard another figure of 197 million acres, but 193 million acres of national forest and grasslands, about 13 million acres in the Southeast, and 4.5 million acres in the Southern Appalachians. North Carolina has 4 national forests. We have the Croatan down on the coast, the Uwharrie in the Piedmont, and the Nantahala and Pisgah in the mountains. And so we'll be talking about the Nantahala-Pisgah, which total about 1 million acres. And these are some of the crown jewels of national forest in our nation. They are very popular and surrounded by millions and millions of people within a day's drive, and we get about 7 million visitors annually on our national forests. About 22% of the 18 counties that host national forest land is made up of national forest. I guess actually 22% of the forest in those counties. So it's important to know that 70% of the forests in the Southern Appalachians, despite our wealth of public land, are privately owned. And our national forests have the highest mountains in the Eastern United States with, Mount Mitchell and the Black Mountain Range. We probably have the most biodiverse national forest if you include all the different kinds of organisms like fungi and insects, plants and fish. And overall, this is just a forest of superlatives. You can go on and on about the most of this and the most of that in this forest. We have forest plans because of the National Forest Management Act, which was passed in 1976 and requires all national forests and grasslands to have a management plan. And these plans are supposed to be revised every 10 to 15 years, but in practice, the average has been around 20. We are over that here with 1994 being the last revision of the plan here, and here we are at 2022. I think that's about 28 years, goodness gracious. Getting old. So the 2012 planning rule is a new forest planning rule. Previous plans had been created under the 1982 planning rule, which was widely regarded as being too difficult to use. And so, there was a hope that the 2012 planning rule would speed things up. That doesn't seem to be the case, actually. 2012 planning rule is providing the Forest Service with more flexibility for planning, but across the country, plans are taking just about as long as they always have. I think the problem there is that the Forest Service has, probably 40% less staff than they did in 1982 when these first round of plans were put out. So even though the planning rule is actually easier to use with fewer people, with fewer planners on the Forest Service side, fewer Forest Service staff to manage these millions of acres of land, planning still takes a long time. Some of the highlights of the 2012 rule is an increased emphasis on public participation and collaboration, a requirement to consider the contribution of Forest Service lands amongst all other lands in the planning area, including private lands, other state and federal public land. The 2012 rule requires that climate change be considered. And this is a place where I think that the Nantahala-Pisgah plan came up pretty far short. Also includes direction on ecological restoration and making ecological integrity the focus of Forest Service management. So yeah, this was a timeline that was put out, I think in 2019, and it predicted at that time that the forest plan would be done in late summer 2020. And here we are, 2022, almost ready to be done with the forest plan. Not quite yet, but so this has taken a long time, almost 10 years. The Forest Service released a final alternative on the plan and a final environmental impact statement. Oh, sorry, pardon me, a draft. They released plan alternatives and draft environmental impact statement February 14th, 2020. So we had this lengthy comment period during the pandemic that ended June 30. And there were thousands and thousands of comments. I can't remember the total. I think it was 7,000 comments came in during the draft environmental impact statement phase. And over the course of the forest plan revision, over 20,000 public comments were received by the Forest Service. The revised plan was released January 21st of this year, and the objection period closed March 22nd. Thousands of objections were received, and the Forest Service has 90 days to respond to objections. The update on those thousands of objections is that only a few hundred of them had official standing. The rule for objections is that objectors must have commented previously on the plan, and their objection must be relevant to their previous comments. So the Forest Service has winnowed down the thousands of objections they received from the public to a few hundred. And you may have heard some groups were encouraging the general public to object. MountainTrue chose not to take that tactic. We see the objection period as a chance to have one final conversation with the Forest Service about the forest plan. And we believe that, believed that by having fewer voices in the room at the objection stage might be a more, productive conversation. So we'll see how it goes. We'll see how the Forest Service manages to deal with the hundreds of objections that they've accepted. After the objection period is over, which should be 90 days, but given the number of objections, the Forest Service could extend that period. I do expect there will be a final decision sometime in 2022 on this plan. And that will be in effect for the next 20 years, more or less. One of the great things about this forest plan is that people of all different perspectives have worked together on this plan. And in particular, the Nantahala-Pisgah Forest Partnership has put in years of work and thousands of hours working together to provide the Forest Service with some really good solutions. And the MountainTrue, of course, was a part of that, and we're really proud of that. We wish the Forest Service had come out with a final plan that was a lot closer to the Forest Partnership's recommendations, but they didn't. And instead what they did was create a new alternative in the plan called Alternative E. I was hoping for a new alternative, but not one that looked like Alternative E. Alternative E actually looked quite a bit like Alternative D from the draft environmental impact statement. Also looked quite a bit like some straw man proposals by the Forest Service from 2016. So, I was not very pleased that there was so little movement after so many years on the part of the Forest Service. Forest Service chose not to analyze many of the key solutions put forward by the Nantahala-Pisgah Forest Partnership. And because of weak plan standards, ambiguous language, and just a generally complex social situation around Nantahala-Pisgah National Forest, there are many dissatisfied parties with the plan. From MountainTrue's perspective, our biggest concerns are that there are over 100,000 acres of existing old growth forests and natural heritage natural areas that were identified by the state of North Carolina, and many potential wilderness areas that were allocated to timber production management areas. And these are lands where the growing and harvesting of trees is the primary or secondary purpose of management. And we think these resources are too special to be dedicated to that purpose. And they could have been kept out of timber production and still had 500,000 acres of other lands available for timber production. But here's a big, broad overview of Nantahala-Pisgah National Forest. Where most of the gray lands there are going to be private or other lands, and the green lands are Nantahala-Pisgah National Forest that the forest plan allocated within the broad zone of consensus. And what I mean by consensus is the majority of the public would support the management that the Forest Service put forward on those lands. And in red, you see those 100,000 acres of lands that I call project landmines. These are places where some forest ranger may try to do a logging project, and it will cause not only damage to the land and the water and the wildlife and plants, but will cause big public controversy. And you can see, some of the places that show up on this map. Let's see if I have any kind of a pointer. Yeah, I have an annotation tool. This is always risky. I think I generally end up having to stop sharing when I do this, but I'm going to try the spotlight tool and see what this does. But some of the real places where I think the Forest Service missed the mark are like the Craggy Mountains here, where the people of Buncombe County and just the public in general submitted thousands of comments asking the Forest Service to designate those to some protective designation. Loads of area on the Pisgah Ranger District, like Cedar Rock Mountain, areas around the South Mills River that really should have gone into a different management area than timber production. Panthertown Valley area, where about half of the area was allocated to timber production. And then, some perhaps less well-known areas, but like Tusquity Bald. This area here was almost entirely outside of timber production under the old plan. And now 11,000 acres of this largest roadless area in the Southern Appalachians have been allocated to timber production. So let's see if I can advance now that I've used the annotation tool. Nope, just as I suspected I cannot. So I'm going to stop sharing, and then I'm going to start sharing again, and I'll be able to advance. Okay, so that's probably the last time I'll use that tool. And it'll probably take a little while for this to wake back up and advance. So we'll see how long it takes. And so I think in this context, it's probably important just to say a word that how forest plans are accomplished. The forest plan sets out some goals and sets out different management areas, and how those goals are accomplished is to do projects that meet the goals. And so one of the biggest goals of this forest plan has been to create young forest wildlife habitat for the wildlife that need that. And there are quite a number of wildlife that will benefit from that. I unfortunately think that by extending that suitable timber base, and harvesting timber is the #1 way the Forest Service makes that young forest habitat, by extending that suitable timber base 100,000 acres beyond the consensus, unfortunately has set the stage for an unproductive forest plan. And let's see if I can, yay, finally it advanced. So advanced backwards actually. Let's see, can I go forwards again? It's really, there we go. Oh yeah, finally, okay. So let's zoom in on a couple of those places I mentioned. Here we have the Craggy Mountains in Buncombe County. And again, Buncombe County government unanimously supported a resolution to have the Forest Service manage this area for its biological values, to support a potential national scenic area designation by Congress in this area. And the Forest Service did some okay things. They took about 10,000 acres of the area and allocated it to a special interest area. Unfortunately, they allocated about 5,000 acres around Coxcomb Mountain, Snowball Mountain, the upper Ox Creek drainage in Weaverville, which is actually one of Weaverville's watersheds, and then a portion of Shope Creek to timber production management areas. And I think that was just a pretty big mistake on the part of the Forest Service. And here's the Panthertown Valley area where you have Panthertown Creek on the lower left-hand corner of the map. And a lot of the popular features of Panthertown down that way. But in red, you have the Flat Creek drainage and portions of Big Pisgah Mountain and the Dismal Fall areas that have been allocated to timber production. And there's a very strong constituency for Panthertown Valley that asked the Forest Service to allocate those to different kinds of management. And what may or may not happen, is that some ranger will come along someday and see this as a spot on the map. They can do some timber harvest, and it's really going to just divide the community, unfortunately. I think that's not what we need for public land management. So let's talk about some of the good elements of the plan. What came out on the good side of the ledger? Well, the Forest Service, in keeping with the financial constraints requirements of the planning rule, where the Forest Service is not allowed to set goals that they don't have the money to actually accomplish, set 2 tiers of management objectives. On the first tier is what they can accomplish with their current budget. And the second tier is what they could accomplish with more resources from partners or if they had bigger budgets from Congress. And actually, what came along last year in the infrastructure bill was a windfall for the Forest Service. So they have way more budget available to them than they had for 20 or 30 years. So that's hopeful. Fire management goals in the plan were increased by 125%, and that's really important for the many plants and animals that respond positively to fire, and in correcting a century of failed fire management policy that relied on fire suppression and tried to eradicate natural process like fire. And in previous drafts of this plan, they had taken away buffers on intermittent streams. So these are streams that may lose their surface water certain portions of the year, but always have water somewhere below the channel if it's not always visible on the surface. Current plan has 50-foot buffers, and the final draft, they maintain those buffers. That's a very good thing. And some of the draft alternatives were very restrictive towards new trail construction. And this forest, probably one of its greatest values is as a recreational forest. And the new plan, I think, came down in a good place with trail construction, and basically allowed new trail construction so long as the trails are well maintained and there's collaborative support for the trail, including some of that maintenance. When it comes to recommendations for designations, the Forest Service endorsed about, like I said, about 2/3 of the Craggy National Scenic Area, designated about 11, or recommended about 11 acres, totaling 49,000 acres for wilderness designation, and recommended 8 new streams for wild and scenic river designation. As far as designations goes, I think some people are going to be angry about there being too few designations. Some people are going to be angry about there being too many. Overall, I think the designations are more or less okay. I think that what's more concerning to me is that there are many areas that were eligible and of quality to be designated, and those were allocated for timber production. And I think that's a big problem. Many of those should have been allocated to something like the ecological interest area or backcountry. Big problem areas with the forest plan, though, do remain beyond just allocations and designations. One of the ones that's most concerning to MountainTrue pertains to roads, trails, and aquatic habitat. And here you see, a rainstorm and muddy water coming off of a forest road into a creek. Nantahala-Pisgah National Forest has 2,200 miles of Forest Service roads that they manage, and about 700 miles of trails. Roads and trails are the biggest contributors to sediment, and particularly roads have a deferred maintenance backlog of over 37 million as of 2013. I can only imagine how big that backlog is now after Tropical Storm Fred last year and just more and more years of underfunding from Congress. Unfortunately, the plan calls for timber harvest goals that will lead to the construction of up to 10 new miles of road annually. But the road maintenance goals are too low to keep up with the current needs, much less this 10 additional miles of road construction. The plan also went backwards on road construction and timber harvest on steep slopes. The current plan has good standards for logging on steep slopes and requires aerial cable logging to lift logs up off steep slopes when the slopes are greater than 40%. And even slopes less than 40% can be steep enough to cause problems, as we'll see in a minute. Unfortunately, the revised plan leaves the decision for slopes over 40% to unspecified specialists within the Forest Service, who will likely be foresters who are the ones who are designing these timber sales. There's going to be no clear standards so far for making the decision whether or not the current aerial cable requirement will be kept in place versus ground-based logging. And of course, the problem with ground-based logging is it requires carving roads onto steep slopes. Another big problem is that the plan allows timber harvest to increase without treatment for non-native invasive plants keeping pace. And I do want to be clear that MountainTrue does support timber harvest on certain portions of the forest. I think the Forest Service does actually a better job than what occurs on private land. And here's an example of a really good looking timber harvest on national forest land with not a whole lot of problems. But there are places where problems do occur. And this particular place is not that steep. There's good access. There was a clear direction to increase or to improve species composition in the forest canopy. Other places though, timber harvest can have really serious impact. So what you're seeing here is what's supposed to be a temporary road. Doesn't look very temporary to me, and it caused really big impacts to the stream downslope. This is the result of that timber harvest, is that when it rained, tons and tons of sediment were washing into the local stream. It's pretty easy to see why when you see an aerial photo of this area. Look at the surface area of roads. These are all temporary timber harvest roads, miles and miles of them just to harvest 60 acres. We were hoping that the forest plan would include better direction on projects like this and more specific standards for protecting water quality. Unfortunately, we believe it went backwards from the current plan. What else is missing from the plan? So one of the big things is direction for how to identify and protect old growth forest. We are fortunate in the Blue Ridge Mountains to have more old growth forest than anywhere else almost in the eastern United States. About 3% of our total landscape and about 10% of national forest land have either never been logged or only very lightly logged, and have just magnificent ancient forests with trees hundreds of years old and natural processes in place that you can't find other places. And unfortunately, the forest plan made the decision to say that old growth forests that are found within the timber production management areas, the decision whether or not to cut those is up to individual district rangers, up to the subjective decision-making of individual district rangers. And we believe that's just too valuable of a resource to leave up to subjective decision-making. There should be objective, clear, and uniform standards for that across the forest plan and across all the national forest acres. Again, those natural heritage natural areas that are the hotspots for diversity of plants and animals on the forest that have been identified by the state of North Carolina. About 40,000 acres of those that were rated at the highest levels are in timber production management areas and unprotected. The forest plan does not have any sort of transportation plan to prioritize maintenance and investment in the road system or any strategy for getting the road maintenance problem under control. Kicks that can down the road to a unspecified transportation plan process that we'll see if that ever happens. They've been promising that since 2015. Also, it lacks priorities for timber harvest and restoration. That's something I'm going to go into a little bit more. And has big problems with accurate analysis that contribute to all the other problems. Also, there was not consideration of carbon sequestered by the forests in the forest plan. And basically the statement in the plan that because the Nantahala-Pisgah would be just a small blip on the radar of climate change, that climate change didn't need to be taken into account too much as far as management activities. And, I think if every nation, if every land manager, if every person thinks that way, we'll never get climate change addressed. We need to think about this collectively, where all of our government agencies and all nations are contributing to this, and we need to work on this as a whole, not cutting it up into little pieces that seem too small to address. So I'm going to dive in now to the topic that's near and dear to my heart as a biologist, which was that lack of priorities being set in the forest plan as far as timber harvest and restoration. And this is a chart of the major ecological systems on the forest, starting with dry oak forest, going down to pine oak heath, shortleaf pine oak, dry mesic oak hickory, mesic oak, acidic cove, high elevation red oak, rich cove, spruce fir, and northern hardwoods. So basically what you see there in that chart is an index for how departed from an idealized natural range of variation, which is the Forest Service definition in the 2012 planning rule for ecological integrity. How departed those ecosystems are from that natural range of variation. And on national forest land, you're seeing, and just across the region on private lands as well, that it is mostly those drier ecozones that are in the red, that are 60, 70, 80% departed from their natural range of variation. And the moister ecozones are less departed. That is because they don't require fire. So this 100 years of fire suppression that we've had across our landscape has not affected these moist ecosystems like cove forest and northern hardwoods forest and spruce fir forest as much. In general, all these ecozones lack several things. They lack young forest to some extent. They have huge deficits of old forest because the majority of our landscape was heavily logged about 180 to 120 years ago. And some of the ecozones, particularly those that rely on fire, are lacking open forests, woodland, savanna, grasslandy kind of conditions. And those are the drivers as far as structurally of departure. There are other problems in these ecosystems, obviously, like non-native invasive plants, like a uniform and monotonous species composition, et cetera. But as far as structure, that's the picture. And so really, as far as restoration goes, the Forest Service could be and probably should be focusing as much as possible on those drier ecozones. The problem being that those drier ecozones don't have as valuable timber. So there's some economic motivation to cut timber in those moisture ecozones because they grow the biggest trees. And so here's a ecozone schematic, kind of just to get you oriented on the landscape. This is by Gary Kaufman, and you'll see this in lots of different talks. It's a great diagram here, but on the landscape, you've got these different portions in the landscape that tend to promote different kinds of vegetation based on elevation and aspect, and landform, et cetera, geology. And so essentially along the streams and at high elevations, you have systems like rich cove forest and acidic cove forest and northern hardwoods forest and spruce fir forest that rarely ever burn naturally. And then on more exposed portions of the landscape, on ridges and lower elevations, you've got pine oak heath and dry mesic oak forest and shortleaf pine oak and dry oak forest, et cetera, that frequently burned prior to industrialization, on the order of multiple times per decade for some of these systems, and sometimes for say mesic oak forest maybe every 20 to 30 years. Unfortunately, the forest plan emphasizes timber harvest in cove forest. This is a problem again because this, for a number of reasons. Now, I'll try to lay this out as best I can. But here we have from the final environmental impact statement. This is the volume of forest of timber that is projected to come off of the Nantahala-Pisgah under a tier 1, which is current scenario, or tier 2 scenario. And alternative E actually allows the cutting of more timber than any of the other previous alternatives, and would even exceed the level at the maximum end of the amount of timber that was harvested in the 1980s, which was widely considered to be unsustainable. And even the chief of the Forest Service remanded the 1987 forest plan to lead to the 1994 plan because that plan was unsustainable in its timber harvest. There was about 5,000 acres a year being clear cut on the Nantahala-Pisgah at that time. And alternative E allows a greater level of timber harvest. Now, that could actually work for a short period of time. It could produce needed young forest habitat, but this cannot go on indefinitely. If it was to go on for a long period of time, it would be unsustainable. And you actually see that in the Forest Service analysis. What the Forest Service says about why alternative E produces more volume is because it, quote, has a more balanced mix. I would say it just has more regeneration, harvest, and cove forest types. And again, these cove forests are the places in the landscape that have the most protection from natural disturbance. They're protected from high winds by surrounding ridges. They have the most moisture, so don't burn very often at all. Very long-lived trees, and naturally have an uneven age structure. And unfortunately, the environmental impact statement is saying we're going to focus on doing even age regeneration harvest of up to 40 acres per patch in this system. And you can see that in the analysis. Now, the Forest Service did not spell this out for us in the environmental impact statement, but they did provide data on their spectrum modeling tool. And here's what happens when you look at all of the potential harvest and then very low levels of natural disturbance that we believe the Forest Service under accounted for, and look at what would be the natural ideal for cove forest. And young forest levels exceed that for almost every period of the planning horizon. Now, what you have on the x-axis there are decades. So 1 would be 10 years, 2 would be 20 years, et cetera. 20 would be 200 years. And so you see out towards the end of the planning horizon going far above the natural range of variation for young forest, and even right away pretty much going above the natural range of variation for young forest in the cove ecozones. And again, this is the forest type that needs this the least. And then so the Forest Service modeling projects essentially because young forest is being created at such a high level through timber harvest, is being created very heavily out of the late successional classes. This is the class before old growth. And this class is going down to almost zero by the end of the planning horizon. You're looking at long-term an unsustainable scenario when harvesting co-forest. And so, here's what co-forest looks like in a very good condition, old growth condition. This is from Big Ivy. This is the kind of stuff that citizens have been asking the Forest Service to protect. And of course, this doesn't always happen, but when you harvest co-forest, these places are the most at risk for invasion by non-native invasive plants. So here you have a clear cut done in 1996, I believe. This is in the Foster Creek area of Henderson County. And you have, one tree species in the overstory, you have tulip poplar, and one herbaceous species in the understory, that's Microstegium viminium, Japanese tallgrass. And that's not what we want to see. That's kind of the nightmare scenario. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have all these dry oak and pine forests that are severely fire suppressed, that have too much density of trees and could be thinned and burned to create a much more diverse and healthy ecosystem like you see here. With a far higher diversity of plants and animals and doing much more as far as protecting communities from fire than these dangerous, overly choked, shrub infested places that you see with fire suppression. So that's a problem. It's one of opportunity cost. The Forest Service very likely will end up focusing a lot of their energy on harvesting in co-forest, just like they've been doing for the past many decades. And this could potentially lead to not enough energy being put towards preparing for the bigger fires we know are coming with climate change in these drier ecosystems. So what do we see coming next in the forest plan? Well, MountainTrue has filed a 200-page objection with the Southern Environmental Law Center, Defenders of Wildlife, and the Wilderness Society, challenging the parts of the forest plan that we believe need correcting. MountainTrue also signed on to the Nantahala-Pisgah Forest Partnership objection. And MountainTrue's goal in all of this is to hopefully try to convince the Forest Service to come up with a solution closer to what the Nantahala-Pisgah Forest Partnership came up with, which is not what MountainTrue would have done on our own, but seemed like a reasonable compromise that really met the needs of all interests. Stay tuned. The Forest Service will be responding and setting up an objection meeting or series of objection meetings, and we'll keep folks informed on how those go. And I'm hoping folks have some questions or want some clarification on some of this, because we have plenty of time, and I appreciate y'all being here and your attention. Yeah, so if there's anything that stood out to you that you'd like to ask about just in the chat or the Q&A, go ahead and type it in. And if you're able to unmute yourself, you can also talk. I'm happy to talk about that. So we have a question from Marcel asking, what can we do? As the public, I think the public has really done a great job on this plan. This has had as much or more public engagement as any plan in the history of the Forest Service. Over 20,000 written comments coming in. Years and years of input, lots of attendance at public meetings, really interested public. This is a beloved forest, and the public has really shown that. I think what the Forest Service has had a hard time doing is cutting through the noise of the different perspectives on the plan. So I think what you can do is to talk to your friends and neighbors and let them know what's going on with the plan. I think you can stay tuned. The Forest Service very well, if the objection process doesn't go well, they may end up redoing the plan. So I hope that's not the case. I hope they're able to make the changes they need to make, but that's certainly a possibility. So Chris Berg asked, how dry an annual rainfall of the dry woods ecosystem that have closed canopy and highly burnable volume? That's a great question. So one important concept is that there is a lot of rainfall variability in the Southern Blue Ridge. We have high mountains and areas further south and west that get 60, 70, 80, 90, maybe even 100 inches of precipitation annually. And we have areas in rain shadows in, like, say, the Asheville French Broad River Basin and east of the Blue Ridge Escarpment in the Grandfather Ranger District that have at lower end, 50, 40, even down into the 30s inches of precipitation. But the real story on fire ecology is more about the landform and the landscape than it is about the precipitation, because there are places that have very high rainfall, like the Cassie Gorges gets 90 inches to 100 inches of rain a year and has huge acreages of these flammable ecosystems. And what the deal there is, those flammable ecosystems grow on very sharp landforms, like ridges that are south and west facing, and get a lot of solar insulation that tends to draw moisture out of the soil. And that steep landform, when rain falls on it, that rain runs downhill into those concave landforms that focus the moisture. And those concave landforms very rarely burn, because so much moisture focuses into them out of those sharp landforms. Those sharp landforms dry out quickly, and especially if they're south or west facing and get that hot afternoon sun, dry out much quicker and are therefore much more able to burn. That's a great question. There's lots of other factors that go into whether a place tends to support fire adapted vegetation. Another big factor is the geology. Some geologies have a lot of base nutrients like calcium or magnesium that lead to more productive plant growth, and that more productive plant growth leads to more mulch, organic matter in the soil. And that deeper soil and organic matter tends to hold moisture better and prohibit fire more. And I can go on about fire ecology alone. So I'll leave it at that for now. Any other questions out there? Well, I'll just ramble on a little bit more and say, just once again, how special these forests are and always have been for the people of this region, and just what a blessing it is to have this public asset that we all collectively own. It's something I try to emphasize all the time and give thanks for all the time. Is that one of the history of the United States is very complicated, very, very complicated. And one of the big complications about it is land ownership and who are the rightful owners of the land. And there's been a lot of injustice around that. And I think public land is one of the more just ways that the United States has chosen to deal with land. And so we have this opportunity to collectively own and manage these lands, and that's what the forest plan is all about. Looks like we got a couple other questions coming in. Amy asked, when does the Forest Service hope to have its final plan in place and for how many years? So yeah, Amy, that final plan should be in place in 2022. I mean, if they were on schedule with the objection process, it would be late June 2022. I expect that to get extended somewhat, but I would hope that they would have the final plan in place sometime in 2022. Forest plans are lasting about 20 years these days. They were intended to last 10 to 15, but they've been lasting closer to 20. Or our plan has been in place about 28 years at this point. And then Arthur asks, how would you go about reintroducing fire into this ecosystem? So the great question, Arthur. Fire is being reintroduced into the ecosystem, and you've probably even seen some smoke this spring, a time or two in the area. And how that's done is that fire practitioners, firefighters actually, identify areas that could benefit from burning to reduce the fuels and to benefit wildlife and native plants. And they either already have control lines like roads around them or large streams, or they create control lines. And that can be kind of a problem if, say a bulldozer drives down a steep slope. So that's a concern sometimes, but generally they have really, really strong control lines, and they closely watch the weather conditions so that the fuel moisture and the wind and the humidity are within parameters that they are confident that fire will not get out of that area. And unlike, I think, historically, fires tended to burn during the driest periods of time. With humans, prescribed fire, they call it, or controlled burns, they like to do that in times when they're sure that they can control the fire, and those are not the driest times. That's different than how fire was historically. But a whole lot of things go into that, including where's the smoke going to go. They try to choose days where there's good lifting and dispersal of smoke, so it goes high into the atmosphere and doesn't land in some neighborhood or some community where people have to breathe it. So a whole lot goes into planning fire. And once they have the plan and they've got the good conditions, they light the fire either by hand or more and more with aerial ignition. So either with a helicopter or with a drone, they can drop little ping pong balls, they call them, and they're kind of like napalm filled ping pong balls. Drop on the ground, they ignite a fire. Naturally, that used to happen via lightning and still does happen quite a bit via lightning. That lightning tends to happen in really dry, those lightning fires in really dry years. And that they tend to be scary, and the Forest Service tends to put those out, those wildfires. But in times when they have those fires in a place where they could burn without endangering people, sometimes they'll let them burn. Jamie asks, is the timber industry so powerful they're driving the move to cut down old growth forest? Jamie, I would say no, not really. I would say the timber industry doesn't want any part of that controversy. By and large, that's more of coming from within the Forest Service and simply individuals inside the Forest Service wanting the flexibility to do what they want to do. And some of them not believing that old growth forest exists because they've been told this myth that there is none. And in other cases, just believing very strongly that young forest is way more valuable than old forest. So even if it is old, it'll be better if it's young. So a lot of different perspectives out there, but I would say it's not coming from the timber industry. The best timber is honestly the stuff that's most abundant, 80 to 100 years old, has less rot than the older forest. A lot of the best and most accessible stuff is in that age range, and so I haven't seen a whole lot of push from the timber industry to cut over it. I do think there's some concern from certain portions of society about too much of the forest getting old, because I think they think it might limit their options in the future. Chris asks, are drones useful for monitoring forest practices? Absolutely. Drones are very useful for that. And MountainTrue has I've actually put it in my budget a number of times to get a drone, and I keep getting denied because we don't have it in our budget to get a drone. And the other thing that I would have to do would be to take a drone operators class to get licensed by the FAA. But that would be, I'd like to do that because I think it'd be a very helpful tool. Drones are being used for a variety of applications in forestry and land management. Everything from deploying LiDAR, which is a laser measurement technique, to monitoring wildlife populations, to looking at water quality, all different sorts of things you can do with drones. So really useful. Let's see. Marcel asks, is the final approval objectionable also? And will there be protests? Marcel, so it's after the objection period is over and the Forest Service makes their final decision, there is no more administrative process. There's no more plan process left. At that point, it would be legal action would be the only recourse. And I really hope it doesn't get to that point, but that would be an option for those so inclined. And then Stephen asked, is it really up to individual rangers to go into their districts and make decisions about whether to harvest or not? Can individual rangers be influenced, lobbied not to do this? Yeah, Stephen, great question. So the Forest Service actually has a structure where district rangers have a lot of autonomy, and they're known as line officers. They're one of the categories of people in the Forest Service that can make final decisions. And yes, they are responsible for all the final decisions on their particular ranger districts about where to build trails, what to do with campgrounds, where to cut timber. All those sorts of questions are the district ranger signs off on. They are the buck stops with them. And can they be lobbied? I mean, yes, they can, I think. I think it's most effective when it comes from people within their community that they know and respect. I haven't seen rangers respond well to being yelled at so much, but I do think that they respond well to, hearing what their local folks are concerned about. Unfortunately, I don't think they're as responsive to what the larger public wants. National forests tend to be in very rural places. And of course, they're national forests. Everybody owns them. So really, everybody in America has a say in them. Unfortunately, I think rangers often answer more to the local pressure than they do to more, abroad, or for better or worse. I think there's times when that's really good actually to respond to that local pressure, but because those people do know the land really well. But I think there's a balancing act there. Those are great questions. Really good discussion, folks. Well, if you're like me, you're probably really excited about the NCAA tournament and the men's championship tonight. And congratulations to South Carolina on winning the women's championship last night. And if there's no more questions, I guess we'll call it a day. And again, thanks so much for attending and all your attention and questions.
Yeah, thank you everyone for coming. And I will, as I mentioned at the beginning, send a follow-up email to everyone with the recording of this and maybe even some more resources. So thank you all.